Detective Marcus Chen had investigated countless missing persons cases over his 23-year career, but none had left him standing before a house that seemed to breathe with malevolent life. The Whitmore residence sat at the end of Elm Street like a festering wound, its Victorian architecture twisted by decades of abandonment into something that defied the laws of physics and reason. The morning mist clung to its warped shutters and sagging porch with unnatural persistence, even as the October sun climbed higher over the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The case file tucked under his arm contained 5 photographs of missing individuals, all last seen in the vicinity of this very house over the past 18 months. Sarah Martinez, 24, vanished after her evening jog. Thomas Reed, 67, disappeared while walking his dog. The pattern continued with mechanical precision, each disappearance separated by exactly 3 months and 4 days. What made Marcus's skin crawl wasn't just the timing, but the witnesses. Descriptions of seeing each victim pause at the house's rusted gate, stare at the structure for several minutes, then walk directly toward the front door, as if summoned by an invisible force. The local police had dismissed these accounts as unreliable, influenced by the house's notorious reputation. But Marcus saw something in the witnesses' eyes during his interviews, something that spoke of genuine terror and confusion. They all described the same haunting detail. The missing persons had smiled as they approached the house, a peaceful expression completely at odds with their usual behavior. When Marcus pressed for more information, each witness had shuddered and changed the subject, as if speaking about that smile brought back memories they desperately wanted to forget. Before we continue, tell us where you're listening from today in the comments below. If you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and moments that challenge our understanding of reality, please consider subscribing. Marcus adjusted his service weapon in his holster and pushed open the gate, which swung inward with a groan that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. The path to the front door stretched before him, overgrown with weeds that had somehow maintained their vibrant green color despite the season. Each step forward felt like walking through invisible molasses, and he found himself counting his breaths to maintain focus. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm helped ground him as the house seemed to lean closer with each passing moment. The front porch creaked under his weight, boards sagging in places where rot had eaten through the wood like hungry termites. Paint peeled from the siding in long, deliberate strips, revealing layers of color underneath that told the story of decades of neglect. Marcus reached for his flashlight and notebook, standard procedure for any investigation, but his hands trembled slightly as he fumed with the equipment. He attributed the sensation to caffeine withdrawal, though he couldn't remember his last cup of coffee that morning. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness beyond the threshold. Marcus called out according to protocol, his voice carrying the authority he'd cultivated over 2 decades of police work. "This is Detective Chen with the State Police. I'm conducting a welfare check. If anyone is inside, please respond." The silence that followed felt thick and oppressive, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Even the usual sounds of suburban life, birds chirping, distant traffic, children playing, seemed muted and far away. He pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a foyer that defied his expectations. Instead of the dust and debris he'd anticipated, the interior appeared almost pristine. Hardwood floors gleamed as if recently polished, and ornate wallpaper displayed intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in his peripheral vision. The air carried the scent of vanilla and cinnamon, warm and inviting rather than the mustiness he'd expected from a house abandoned for decades. Marcus advanced into the main hallway, his footsteps echoing with unusual clarity. Family portraits lined the walls, their subjects dressed in clothing that spanned different eras. He paused to examine them more closely, noting how the eyes in each painting seemed to track his movement through the hallway. The effect was likely a trick of perspective, he reasoned, a common phenomenon in portraiture. Yet the sensation of being watched grew stronger, with each step deeper into the house. The living room opened to his right, furnished with period-appropriate pieces that showed no signs of deterioration. A grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, its pendulum swinging with hypnotic precision. Marcus checked his watch and frowned. The clock displayed 3:17, but his digital watch showed 11:42 a.m. He tapped the face of his watch, wondering if the battery was failing, but the display remained unchanged. The discrepancy sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the house's temperature. Moving toward the staircase that curved upward to the second floor, Marcus noticed something that made him stop completely. Fresh flowers sat in a vase on a side table, their petals bright and full, droplets of water still clinging to the stems. Someone had been in this house recently, very recently. His hand moved instinctively to his radio, but when he tried to call for backup, only static emerged from the device. He tried his cell phone with the same result. No signal, no connection to the outside world. The isolation should have alarmed him, should have triggered his training to retreat and reassess. Instead, Marcus found himself drawn deeper into the house's interior. Each room revealed more impossibilities. A kitchen where fresh bread cooling on the counter filled the air with the aroma of recent baking. A study where an open book lay beside a still warm cup of tea, its pages turning gently in a breeze that had no source. The house pulsed around him with a life force that seemed to grow stronger as he explored its mysteries. When he reached the base of the staircase, Marcus paused to examine a series of photographs arranged on a narrow table. Each image showed groups of people at various social gatherings, their faces filled with joy and laughter. But as he looked closer, he began to recognize some of the faces. Sarah Martinez smiled from a family barbecue photo. Thomas Reed raised a glass and a toast at what appeared to be a wedding reception. One by one, he identified all 5 missing persons, each captured in moments of happiness that seemed to radiate warmth and contentment. The discovery should have filled him with excitement at finding a crucial clue. Instead, a profound sadness washed over him, as if he were looking at memorial photographs of people who had found perfect peace in their final moments. Marcus shook his head, trying to dispel the morbid thoughts that seemed to creep into his mind uninvited. He was a detective, trained to think logically and methodically. These photographs were evidence, nothing more, nothing less. But as he climbed the stairs to the second floor, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the house was welcoming him home, that each step brought him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he was prepared to face. The wallpaper seemed to breathe around him, expanding and contracting in rhythm with his heartbeat, and the temperature grew warmer with each ascending step, as if he were climbing toward a source of infinite comfort and belonging. Behind him, the grandfather clock continued its steady ticking, marking time in a house where time itself seemed to flow according to different rules than the world outside. The second-floor hallway stretched longer than the house's exterior dimensions should have allowed, lined with doors that stood slightly ajar as if inviting exploration. Marcus counted 7 doorways, though he was certain the house's blueprint couldn't accommodate that many rooms. Each door bore a brass nameplate, and as he moved closer to read them, his blood ran cold. The names matched his missing persons exactly: Sarah Martinez, Thomas Reed, Jennifer Walsh, Robert Morrison, and David Kowalski. 2 additional plates remained blank, their brass surfaces polished to a mirror shine. Marcus approached the first door, marked Sarah Martinez, and peered inside. The room beyond defied every expectation he'd formed about this abandoned house. Soft afternoon sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating a bedroom that belonged in a luxury hotel rather than a decrepit Victorian. The 4-poster bed was made with military precision, its white linens crisp and inviting. Personal belongings were arranged thoughtfully throughout the space. Running shoes placed neatly by the window, a romance novel bookmarked halfway through, and a framed photograph of a golden retriever on the nightstand. The attention to detail unsettled him more than any obvious signs of violence would have. This wasn't a crime scene, it was a sanctuary. Someone had taken great care to create a space that reflected Sarah Martinez's personality and interests. Her missing persons report mentioned her love of running and her dog named Chester. The photograph on the nightstand showed the same golden retriever, tail wagging with unbridled joy. Marcus moved to the next room, labeled Thomas Reed, and found a similar scene of impossible perfection. The space was decorated in masculine tones of deep blues and rich browns, with a comfortable recliner positioned to face a window overlooking a garden that hadn't existed moments before. Tools were organized on a workbench with obsessive care, each implement cleaned and placed exactly where it would be most useful. A crossword puzzle lay on a side table, partially completed in neat handwriting, with a mechanical pencil resting beside it. The pattern continued through each room. Jennifer Walsh's space reflected her reported interest in watercolor painting, with an easel displaying a half-finished landscape of breathtaking beauty. Robert Morrison's room contained shelves lined with model trains arranged in perfect formations, each engine and car maintained with collector-level precision. David Kowalski's quarters showcased his passion for chess, with multiple boards displaying various game positions that suggested deep strategic thinking. Each room told a story of someone who had found their ideal existence, their perfect refuge from the complexities and disappointments of the outside world. Marcus felt a growing sense of understanding, as if the house was revealing its true nature to him piece by piece. This wasn't a place where people were taken against their will. It was a place where they chose to stay, where they discovered versions of themselves freed from the constraints of ordinary reality. The realization should have disturbed him, should have triggered his law enforcement instincts to document evidence and call for immediate backup. Instead, Marcus found himself feeling envious of the missing persons. When was the last time he'd felt the kind of peace and contentment reflected in these carefully crafted sanctuaries? His own apartment was a sterile collection of furniture and case files, devoid of the personal touches that made these rooms feel truly alive. He approached one of the blank nameplates and was startled to see letters beginning to etch themselves into the brass surface. Marcus. The engraving continued with deliberate precision. Chen. His own name appeared in elegant script, as if the house had been expecting his arrival all along. The sight should have terrified him, should have sent him running toward the exit and back to the rational world of police procedures and evidence collection. Instead, Marcus felt a profound sense of recognition, as if he were seeing his own name written in a place he'd been searching for his entire adult life. The second blank nameplate remained empty, waiting for someone else, but his attention was drawn to the door that now bore his name. It stood open wider than the others, revealing glimpses of a room that seemed designed specifically for his needs and desires. Marcus stepped across the threshold and gasped. The space beyond was everything he'd never dared to hope for in his cramped apartment and demanding career. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with mystery novels, police procedural guides, and true crime accounts that had fascinated him since childhood. A massive oak desk occupied the center of the room, its surface clear, except for a single case file that lay open to reveal handwriting he recognized as his own. The file contained detailed notes about the Whitmore House investigation, but the handwriting was neater than his usual hurried scrawl, and the insights were deeper and more nuanced than anything he'd managed to produce in his official reports. This version of Marcus Chen was a better detective, a more thoughtful investigator, someone who had found the perfect balance between analytical reasoning and intuitive understanding. A leather chair behind the desk called to him with the promise of comfort he'd never experienced in any office furniture. Marcus sat down and immediately felt the tension in his shoulders evaporate. The chair seemed molded to his exact specifications, supporting him in all the right places, while encouraging perfect posture. He picked up a pen from the desk holder and was amazed by how perfectly it fit his grip, how smoothly the ink flowed across the paper when he added a note to the case file. Outside the window, he could see a view that hadn't existed moments before. A peaceful garden where the 5 missing persons sat together at a round table, playing cards and laughing with genuine joy. They looked exactly as they had in their photographs, but their faces carried a serenity that spoke of people who had found their true purpose in life. Sarah Martinez waved at him through the window, her smile radiant with contentment. Marcus waved back instinctively, feeling a connection to these people that transcended his role as their investigator. They weren't victims. They were pioneers who had discovered something extraordinary. They had found a place where their best selves could flourish, without the interference of a world that consistently demanded compromise and mediocrity. The house hadn't taken them. It had offered them a choice, and they had chosen wisely. The rationality that had guided his career for over 2 decades whispered warnings about psychological manipulation and elaborate criminal schemes, but those concerns felt distant and irrelevant compared to the immediate reality of sitting in a room that understood him completely. For the first time in years, Marcus felt truly at home. Hours seemed to pass, though the light outside his window remained constant, bathed in the golden glow of eternal afternoon. Marcus had been reading through case files that documented investigations he'd never actually conducted, each one solved with elegant precision and insight that surpassed his real-world capabilities. The handwriting was unmistakably his, but the detective described in these reports was a version of himself freed from bureaucratic constraints and political pressures. A soft knock on his door interrupted his reading. Marcus looked up to see Sarah Martinez standing in the doorway, her face glowing with the kind of health and vitality that suggested months of perfect rest and nutrition. She wore a simple white dress that seemed to shimmer in the room's gentle light, and her eyes held a wisdom that transcended her 24 years. "Detective Chen," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that made his name sound like poetry. "We've been waiting for you to join us for dinner. The others are so excited to meet you properly." She gestured toward the window, where the garden table was now set with fine china and crystal glasses that caught the light like captured rainbows. Marcus rose from his chair, surprised by how natural the movement felt. The chronic back pain that had plagued him for years had disappeared entirely, leaving him feeling as limber and energetic as he had in his 20s. "Sarah, I need to ask you some questions about your disappearance. There are people who are worried about you, who need to know you're safe." Her laughter was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, musical and soothing. "Oh, Detective, don't you see? We are safe. We're safer here than we've ever been in our entire lives. The world out there?" She gestured vaguely toward what Marcus assumed was the direction of the outside world. "It's full of pain and disappointment and compromise. Here, we can be who we were always meant to be. But your family, your friends, they're searching for you. They're worried sick, thinking something terrible has happened." Marcus felt obligated to voice these concerns, though they seemed increasingly abstract and unimportant compared to the immediate reality of Sarah's radiant presence. "My family?" Sarah's expression grew thoughtful, as if she were trying to remember something from a distant dream. "Yes, I remember them. They loved a version of me that was always anxious, always trying to live up to expectations that didn't fit who I really am. Here, I can run for miles without getting tired. I can read entire novels in single afternoons. I can paint landscapes that capture the exact beauty I see in my mind. Why would I want to go back to being someone smaller than my true self?" Her words resonated with Marcus in ways that made his chest tighten with recognition. How many times had he compromised his ideals to fit bureaucratic requirements? How many cases had he closed with incomplete solutions, because budget constraints or political pressures demanded quick results? How many nights had he gone home, feeling like he'd failed to live up to his own standards of justice and truth? "Come." Sarah extended her hand toward him, and Marcus noticed that her skin seemed to emit its own soft radiance. "The others are waiting, and Mrs. Whitmore has prepared the most amazing feast. You'll love Thomas. He has the most incredible stories about his woodworking projects. And Jennifer's paintings. Detective, you've never seen anything so beautiful." Marcus hesitated at the threshold of his room. Some deeply ingrained part of his training insisted that he should be documenting this encounter, calling for backup, following established protocols for missing persons investigations. But those procedures seemed designed for a world where people disappeared against their will, where they needed rescue from dangerous situations. What protocols existed for people who had found paradise? "Who is Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked, grasping for some thread of investigative logic to guide him through this surreal situation. "She's the one who takes care of us, who makes sure we have everything we need to become our best selves." Sarah's eyes sparkled with affection. "She's been waiting so long for you to arrive, Detective. She knew you were special, knew you'd understand what this place really offers." They walked together down the hallway, which now seemed perfectly proportioned and welcoming, rather than impossibly long. The portraits on the walls had changed, Marcus noticed. Instead of the formal family photographs he'd observed earlier, the frames now contained candid shots of the missing persons, engaged in activities that clearly brought them joy. Sarah running through meadows with her arms outstretched, Thomas crafting an intricate wooden sculpture, Jennifer painting en plein air in a sun-dappled forest. The staircase descended to a dining room that hadn't existed during his initial exploration of the house. A massive table dominated the space, set with enough places for 8 people. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over walls, lined with artwork that seemed to shift and change as Marcus looked at them, each piece reflecting the artistic style of whoever was viewing it at that moment. The missing persons were already seated around the table, their faces bright with anticipation and genuine affection as they saw Marcus approach. Thomas Reed stood and extended a weathered hand, his grip firm and sure. "Detective Chen, what an honor to meet you. Sarah's told us so much about your reputation for getting to the truth of things. "Please, call me Marcus," he replied, surprised by how easily he accepted the informal address from someone he was supposed to be investigating. "Marcus it is," said Jennifer Walsh, a woman in her 30s whose paint-stained fingers suggested she'd been working on an artistic project moments before dinner. "You'll love it here, Marcus. We all do. Each day brings new discoveries about who we can really be when we're not constrained by other people's limitations." Robert Morrison, a quiet man in his 50s, nodded enthusiastically. "The model train layouts I've been able to create here, they're beyond anything I ever imagined possible. Perfect scale, perfect detail, and they run on tracks that extend far beyond what this room should be able to contain." David Kowalski gestured to a chess set positioned on a side table, its pieces arranged in a complex pattern that seemed to shift and evolve even as Marcus watched. "The games here are extraordinary, Marcus. Each match teaches me something new about strategy and life. I've been playing opponents who challenge me in ways I never experienced in the outside world." Marcus took his seat at the table, noting that his chair was positioned directly across from an empty place setting that presumably belonged to the mysterious Mrs. Whitmore. The arrangement felt deliberately ceremonial, as if his arrival completed some important ritual or gathering. "Where is Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked, looking around the dining room for signs of their hostess. The 5 former missing persons exchanged meaningful glances, their expressions suggesting they shared some important secret. "She'll join us soon," Sarah said with a knowing smile. "She's been preparing something very special for your arrival. She wants everything to be perfect for your first dinner with us." As if summoned by their conversation, footsteps echoed from the direction of what Marcus assumed was the kitchen. The sound was measured and deliberate, suggesting someone taking great care with each step. The missing persons straightened in their chairs, their faces lighting up with the kind of anticipation children might show when expecting a beloved grandmother to arrive with homemade treats. Marcus felt his own pulse quicken, though whether from excitement or apprehension he couldn't determine. Everything about this situation defied his training and experience, yet he found himself eager to meet the woman who had created this sanctuary for people seeking refuge from an imperfect world. The footsteps grew closer, and Marcus prepared to encounter the person who held the key to understanding what had really happened to the 5 missing individuals sitting around this impossible table in this house that existed beyond the normal rules of reality. Mrs. Whitmore entered the dining room with the graceful bearing of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, though she appeared to be in her 70s with silver hair arranged in an elegant chignon and wearing a deep blue dress that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. Her face bore the kind of timeless beauty that suggested someone who had lived fully and found peace with every decision she'd ever made. When she smiled at Marcus, he felt an immediate sense of recognition, as if he were looking at someone he'd known and trusted his entire life. "Detective Chen," she said, her voice carrying the warm authority of a beloved teacher or mentor. "Welcome to my home. I've been so looking forward to meeting you. Your reputation for seeking truth above all else precedes you, and I believe you'll find what you discover here will change your understanding of what's possible in this world." She took her seat at the head of the table with fluid grace, and immediately the empty serving dishes began filling with food that appeared as if materialized from the air itself. Roasted chicken that smelled like Sunday dinners from Marcus's childhood, vegetables that gleamed with the perfect ripeness of a harvest festival, bread that carried the aroma of his grandmother's kitchen. Each dish seemed personally calibrated to evoke his most cherished food memories. "Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus began, his detective instincts still functioning despite the surreal nature of his circumstances. "I need to understand what happened to these people. They were reported missing, and their families are desperate for answers about their whereabouts and well-being." She served him a portion of chicken, with movements that seemed choreographed to perfection, each gesture economical yet graceful. "Of course you do, Detective. It's in your nature to seek answers, to protect people from harm. But tell me, do any of these individuals appear to be in distress? Do they seem to be held here against their will?" Marcus looked around the table at faces that radiated contentment and joy. Sarah was laughing at something Thomas had whispered to her, her expression free from the anxiety that had marked her features in her missing persons photograph. Jennifer and Robert were discussing artistic techniques with the passionate intensity of people who had found their true calling. David was studying the chess set with the focused concentration of someone solving a puzzle that brought him genuine pleasure. "They appear to be happy," Marcus admitted, though his training warned him that appearances could be deceptive, that victims of sophisticated psychological manipulation might not recognize their own captivity. Happy, Mrs. Whitmore repeated as if tasting the word. Such a simple concept, yet so elusive in the world beyond these walls. Tell me, detective, when was the last time you felt genuinely happy? Not satisfied with a job well done, not pleased with solving a difficult case, but truly, deeply happy with who you are and how you're spending your life? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow, forcing him to confront truths he'd been avoiding for years. His marriage had ended 5 years ago, dissolved by the demands of his career and his inability to be present for the relationship. His social life consisted primarily of colleagues who shared war stories about difficult cases and bureaucratic frustrations. His hobbies had been abandoned one by one, as work consumed increasing amounts of his time and energy. Happiness is a luxury I can't afford, he said, the response automatic after years of defending his lifestyle choices to concerned friends and family members. People depend on me to find missing persons, to solve cases that matter to families who are suffering. Personal happiness seems selfish when there's so much work to be done. Mrs. Whitmore's smile carried infinite compassion, as if she were looking at a wounded animal that didn't yet understand it could be healed. And how many cases have you solved to your complete satisfaction, detective? How many times have you found all the answers, delivered perfect justice, and felt that your work truly made the world a better place? Marcus opened his mouth to recite his career statistics, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself remembering cases that had haunted him for years. Criminals who had escaped on technicalities, victims whose families never received closure, investigations that had been closed due to budget constraints rather than actual resolution. The bureaucratic machine that employed him cared more about clearance rates than truth, more about public relations than genuine justice. I see you understand, Mrs. Whitmore continued gently. You've spent decades serving a system that consistently falls short of your ideals. You've compromised your vision of what justice should look like in order to function within institutions that prioritize efficiency over truth. But here, detective, you could be the investigator you've always wanted to be. She gestured toward his room upstairs, and somehow Marcus could see through the walls to the case files he'd been reading, each one representing the kind of thorough, methodical investigation he'd always dreamed of conducting. No budget constraints, no political pressure, no bureaucratic interference, just you and the truth, with all the time and resources you need to pursue justice in its purest form. But what about their families? Marcus gestured toward the missing persons around the table. What about the people who love them and need to know they're safe? Thomas Reed set down his fork and looked directly at Marcus, his eyes clear and thoughtful. Detective, my wife died 3 years ago. My children live across the country and call me twice a year out of obligation rather than affection. My neighbors knew me as the old man who kept to himself and occasionally complained about their music being too loud. Here, I have friends who appreciate my stories, who value my experience, who see me as someone worth knowing rather than someone to be tolerated. Jennifer Walsh nodded in agreement. My art was rejected by galleries for being too conventional, too safe. I worked in an office job that drained my creativity because I needed health insurance and steady income. Here, I can paint for 12 hours a day and create work that actually expresses what I see in my mind. My family will grieve for a while, but they'll move on. They have their own lives to live. Robert Morrison's voice was quiet but firm. My wife left me 2 years ago. She said I cared more about my model trains than our relationship. And maybe she was right. But here, my passion is celebrated rather than ridiculed. I've built railway systems that span continents, that transport tiny passengers through landscapes more beautiful than anything in the real world. David Kowalski looked up from his chess set. I was unemployed for 8 months before coming here. My unemployment benefits had run out. I was facing eviction, and I spent my days applying for jobs that either ignored me or offered wages that wouldn't cover basic survival. Here, I play chess with masters from across history, I solve puzzles that challenge my intellect, and I never worry about rent or groceries or whether I'm worth anything to society. Sarah Martinez's voice carried a note of gentle sadness for Marcus's confusion. Detective, we're not victims. We're people who were offered a choice between struggling in a world that didn't value who we really are and flourishing in a place that celebrates our authentic selves. We chose authenticity. Mrs. Whitmore refilled Marcus's wine glass with liquid that tasted like every perfect vintage she'd ever sampled. The question now, detective, is what choice will you make? You can return to your world of incomplete investigations and bureaucratic compromises, or you can stay here and become the investigator you've always dreamed of being. But understand this, Once you leave, you won't be able to find this place again. This opportunity comes only once." Marcus felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. Everything logical and professional in his nature insisted that he should leave immediately, return to his responsibilities, file reports about the missing persons, and let proper authorities determine how to proceed. But as he looked around a table at faces filled with genuine peace and contentment, he wondered if his definition of responsibility might be fundamentally flawed. The grandfather clock in the living room chimed midnight, though it had been showing 3:17 since his arrival. Time itself seemed negotiable in this place, subject to needs and desires rather than the rigid progression that governed the outside world. "I need time to think," Marcus said finally. Mrs. Whitmore's smile was patient and understanding. "Of course you do, Detective. Take all the time you need. Your room will be waiting whenever you're ready to rest, and we'll be here when you wake up. In this house, there's never any pressure to make decisions before you're truly ready." As the dinner conversation resumed around topics of art and woodworking and chess strategies, Marcus found himself wondering what kind of man he might become if he were freed from the constraints that had defined his adult life. The possibility was as terrifying as it was appealing, and he knew that whatever choice he made would determine not just his future, but his understanding of who he had always been meant to be. Marcus excused himself from the dinner table and wandered through rooms that seemed to expand and contract according to his emotional state. When he felt claustrophobic thinking about the decision facing him, ceilings rose and walls pushed outward, creating cathedral-like spaces filled with soft light and peaceful acoustics. When he craved intimacy and security, the rooms became cozy sanctuaries, with fireplaces that crackled with warming flames and furniture that invited contemplation. He found himself in what appeared to be a library, though he was certain this room hadn't existed during his initial exploration of the house. Floor-to-ceiling shelves contained every book he'd ever wanted to read, but hadn't found time for during his career-focused decades. First editions of detective novels sat beside philosophical treatises on justice and morality, their leather bindings pristine, despite apparent age. A comfortable reading chair positioned near a window offered views of a moonlit garden, where night-blooming flowers released fragrances that seemed designed to calm his troubled thoughts. Marcus selected a book at random and was startled to discover it was a detailed analysis of his own cases, written by an author whose insights into his investigative methods surpassed his own understanding of his work. The text praised his intuitive leaps and methodical approach while identifying patterns in his thinking that he'd never recognized. According to this anonymous biographer, Marcus Chen had the potential to become one of the great detectives of his generation, if only he could free himself from institutional limitations. The validation felt intoxicating, like finally receiving recognition he'd craved without realizing it. But as he read further, Marcus began to understand that this wasn't just flattery designed to keep him in the house. The analysis was accurate, identifying both his strengths and weaknesses with surgical precision. His tendency to become emotionally invested in victims, families sometimes clouded his judgment. His respect for authority occasionally prevented him from pursuing unconventional investigative approaches that might yield better results. His fear of failure led him to accept incomplete solutions rather than risk the criticism that came with unsolved cases. A soft knock on the library door interrupted his reading. Mrs. Whitmore entered carrying a tray with tea and small pastries that released the aroma of his childhood comfort foods. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in her environment, settling into a chair across from his with the fluid grace of practiced hospitality. "I thought you might appreciate some refreshment while you think," she said, pouring tea from a china service that seemed to have materialized specifically for this moment. That particular book was written by someone who understands the burden of unfulfilled potential. He spent his life knowing he could be more than circumstances allowed, and he wanted to share what he learned with others facing similar choices. Marcus accepted the cup, noting that the tea was exactly the right temperature and flavor to soothe his conflicted thoughts. "Who was the author?" "Someone very much like you, Detective. A man who spent decades serving institutions that valued conformity over excellence, who compromised his vision of what he could accomplish in order to fit within systems designed for mediocrity." Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried the weight of personal experience, as if she were describing someone she had known intimately. "Are you saying he lived here too?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. This house has provided sanctuary for many people over the decades, Detective. Artists whose work was too innovative for commercial galleries, scientists whose theories challenged accepted paradigms, inventors whose creations were ahead of their time. Each person who found their way here faced the same choice you're confronting now: accept the limitations imposed by others, or embrace the possibility of becoming their authentic self. Marcus set down his teacup and looked directly at Mrs. Whitmore, studying her face for signs of deception or manipulation. Her expression remained open and compassionate, but he detected something else beneath the surface: a profound sadness that seemed to stem from intimate knowledge of human potential squandered by fear and social pressure. "What are you exactly?" he asked, abandoning any pretense of conventional investigation. "Are you human, or something else entirely?" Her laughter was musical and genuine, free from the defensive quality that usually accompanied such direct questions. "I'm someone who learned long ago that the categories we use to define existence are far more flexible than most people realize. I'm someone who found a way to create space for people to become who they were always meant to be, regardless of what others expected from them." That's not really an answer, isn't it? Mrs. Whitmore's eyes sparkled with affection for his persistence. "You're thinking like a detective, which is exactly what you should do. But consider this. Does my precise nature matter as much as the choice I'm offering? If I told you I was an angel or a demon or an interdimensional being, or simply a very unusual human, would that information change the fundamental decision you need to make about your own life?" Marcus realized she was right. His detective instincts wanted to categorize and label everything, to fit this experience into familiar frameworks that would allow him to write reports and follow established procedures. But the real question wasn't about Mrs. Whitmore's identity. It was about whether he was brave enough to choose authentic happiness over familiar misery. "What happens to the people who choose to stay?" he asked. "Do they age? Do they die? Are they trapped here forever?" "They become the best versions of themselves," Mrs. Whitmore replied simply. "They age at whatever rate feels right for their journey of self-discovery. They die only when they've completed everything they came here to accomplish, which might take decades or centuries, depending on the scope of their dreams. And they're no more trapped here than you are trapped in your current life, Detective. The difference is that here, their cage is made of possibility rather than limitation." She stood and moved to the library window, gazing out at the garden, where the 5 former missing persons had gathered around a fire pit that hadn't existed during dinner. Their faces glowed with the warmth of genuine friendship as they shared stories and laughter that echoed through the night air like music. "Look at them, Detective. In their previous lives, they were isolated by circumstances, disconnected from people who truly understood their passions and dreams. Here, they found their tribe, their family of choice. They support each other's growth and celebrate each other's achievements without the jealousy and competition that poisoned their relationships in the outside world." Marcus joined her at the window, watching Sarah demonstrate a running technique to Thomas, who was apparently interested in improving his evening walks. Jennifer was sketching David as he contemplated a chess move, capturing the intensity of his concentration in quick, confident strokes. Robert was explaining some detail about locomotive engineering to the group, his face animated with the joy of sharing knowledge with people who appreciated his expertise. "They do seem genuinely happy," Marcus admitted, though his detective instincts continued to search for signs of coercion or psychological manipulation. "But what about justice? What about the criminals who go free while I'm here, pursuing personal fulfillment? What about the victims who don't get the investigation they deserve?" Mrs. Whitmore turned to face him, her expression serious, but not judgmental. "Tell me, Detective, how many criminals have you actually prevented from reoffending through your investigations? How many victims' families have found lasting peace through the justice you've been able to deliver? How many cases have you solved so completely that you felt the system worked exactly as it should?" The questions hit their mark with uncomfortable accuracy. Marcus's conviction rate was respectable by departmental standards, but most of the criminals he'd arrested would eventually be released and return to lives of crime. The families he'd helped often remained trapped in cycles of grief and anger, despite receiving legal closure. The system he served was designed more for processing cases efficiently than for delivering meaningful justice. "But if people like me abandon the system, who will try to make it better?" he asked, clinging to the idealistic vision that had originally drawn him to law enforcement. "People like you don't change systems, Detective. Systems change people like you. They take your passion for justice and redirect it toward bureaucratic compliance. They take your desire to help victims and transform it into a need to meet arrest quotas. They take your commitment to truth and twist it into willingness to accept convenient explanations that close cases quickly. Mrs. Whitmore's words carried the weight of someone who had observed this process many times before. The question isn't whether you can reform an institution that actively resists reformation. The question is whether you're willing to continue sacrificing your authentic self to serve a system that will never allow you to achieve your true potential. Marcus felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced countless times when forced to compromise his ideals to maintain his career. How many times had he accepted plea bargains that felt like betrayals of victims' trust? How many times had he been ordered to close investigations that deserved more thorough exploration? How many times had he gone home feeling like he'd failed to live up to his own standards of what a detective should be? "If I stay," he said slowly, "what exactly would I do? What would my life look like?" Mrs. Whitmore smiled, and Marcus saw a glimpse of the profound satisfaction that came from helping someone discover their true path. "You would investigate, detective. You would pursue truth without constraints, solve mysteries that have haunted humanity for centuries, explore questions that conventional law enforcement never has time or resources to examine. You would be the detective you always dreamed of becoming, the one who finds answers that matter rather than answers that satisfy bureaucratic requirements." She gestured toward the shelves around them, and Marcus noticed that many of the books contained case files for historical mysteries: the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, the identity of Jack the Ripper, the truth behind the Zodiac Killer. Each file appeared to contain information that went far beyond what conventional investigators have been able to discover. "These cases have been waiting for someone with your particular combination of intuition and methodology," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "Someone who cares more about truth than credit, more about justice than career advancement. Someone who understands that the most important mysteries are often the ones that institutions prefer to leave unsolved." Marcus pulled one of the files from the shelf and opened it to find crime scene photographs and witness statements that provided new evidence about the Black Dahlia murder. The investigation notes were written in his own handwriting, but they demonstrated analytical insights that surpassed anything he'd achieved in his official career. This version of Marcus Chen had access to resources and information that transcended normal investigative limitations. "How is this possible?" he asked, holding up the file. "The same way Sarah can run faster and farther than she ever could before, the same way Jennifer can paint with colors that don't exist in the ordinary world, the same way Thomas can craft wooden sculptures that seem to contain living spirits." Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone explaining natural phenomena. When people are freed from artificial limitations, they discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. A clock chimed somewhere in the house, marking an hour that didn't correspond to any timepiece Marcus could see. The sound seemed to echo from multiple directions, creating a harmony that was both familiar and otherworldly. Outside the window, the 5 former missing persons were preparing to return to their rooms, their faces peaceful, with the satisfaction of an evening well spent among true friends. "I need to see something," Marcus said suddenly, struck by an idea that had been forming in the back of his mind. "I need to see what happens if I try to leave. I need to know if I actually have a choice, or if this is just a very sophisticated form of imprisonment." Mrs. Whitmore nodded with the understanding of someone who had anticipated this request. "Of course, detective. You wouldn't be who you are if you didn't need to test the boundaries of your situation. Go ahead, try to leave. I'll be here when you return." Her confidence unsettled him more than any attempt to persuade him to stay would have. Either she was certain he wouldn't be able to leave, or she was equally certain he would choose to return. Both possibilities suggested a level of control or insight that challenged his sense of free will. Marcus set down the case file and walked toward the library door, pausing to look back at Mrs. Whitmore. She had settled into her chair with a book, apparently prepared to wait patiently for his return. Her calm acceptance of his decision to test his freedom felt more ominous than any threat or plea would have. As he walked through the house toward the front door, Marcus tried to maintain his detective's objectivity, but the atmosphere seemed to shift around him in response to his intentions. The hallways felt longer and more labyrinthine. The portraits on the wall seemed to watch him with disapproving expressions, and the temperature dropped several degrees with each step toward the exit. By the time he reached the front door, Marcus was shivering despite the sweater that had materialized on his body sometime during his walk through the house. His breath formed visible clouds in the suddenly frigid air, and the doorknob felt like ice against his palm. He turned the handle and stepped out onto the front porch. The world beyond the house's threshold had transformed into a nightmarish reflection of the reality Marcus remembered. The charming suburban street where he'd parked his car hours ago was now a desolate wasteland of cracked pavement and abandoned vehicles. Skeletal trees lined the roadway, their branches reaching toward a sky the color of dried blood. The air carried the stench of decay and industrial pollution, making each breath a struggle against nausea and despair. Marcus's car sat where he'd left it, but the vehicle was now rusted and broken, its windows shattered and tires flat. Weeds had grown through cracks in the metal, as if the automobile had been abandoned for decades rather than hours. When he tried his cell phone, the screen displayed a message that made his blood run cold. No service available. Last contact with civilization, 847 days ago. He walked toward the neighboring houses, hoping to find signs of normal life, but each structure showed evidence of long abandonment. Windows were boarded up or broken, lawns had become overgrown jungles, and front doors hung open to reveal interiors stripped of anything valuable. Graffiti covered many of the walls, but instead of typical urban art or gang tags, the messages were desperate pleas for help. Is anyone out there? Please come back for me. The world ended while we weren't watching. The silence was the most disturbing aspect of this transformed landscape. No traffic, no voices, no sounds of daily life that should have characterized a residential neighborhood. Even the wind seemed muted, creating an oppressive quiet that made Marcus's footsteps echo like gunshots. When he called out for help, his voice was swallowed by the emptiness, producing no response except the mocking echo of his own desperation. Marcus tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Had he been in the house for days rather than hours? Had some catastrophe befallen the outside world while he was exploring Mrs. Whitmore's impossible sanctuary? Or was this another manifestation of the house's power, a demonstration of what reality looked like when stripped of hope and possibility? He walked to the end of the block, hoping to find a main road that might lead to functioning civilization, but the residential street simply ended in a wall of impenetrable fog. When he tried to push through the barrier, he found himself turned around and walking back toward the house without any memory of changing direction. The fog wasn't just a visual obstruction. It was a boundary that redirected his movements regardless of his conscious intentions. After an hour of exploring this devastated version of reality, Marcus began to understand that he was seeing the world as it truly was when filtered through the lens of his own pessimism and disillusionment. This wasteland reflected the cynicism that had accumulated over decades of working within systems that consistently failed to deliver justice. The abandoned houses represented the isolation he'd accepted as the price of his career dedication. The silence embodied the emotional numbness he'd cultivated to protect himself from the pain of constant disappointment. The revelation was both terrifying and liberating. If this desolation represented his honest assessment of the world outside Mrs. Whitmore's house, then perhaps his reluctance to leave wasn't cowardice or self-indulgence. Perhaps it was an accurate recognition that the life he'd been living had become a form of slow spiritual death, a gradual surrender of everything that had once made him passionate about justice and truth. Marcus returned to the house, noting that the front door opened easily despite his earlier struggle with the frozen doorknob. The interior welcomed him with warm light and the faint aroma of coffee brewing somewhere in the depths of the building. The hallways had returned to their proper proportions, and the portraits on the walls showed faces filled with contentment rather than judgment. He found Mrs. Whitmore in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the efficient movements of someone who had performed these tasks countless times before. Sunlight streamed through windows that offered views of a garden in full bloom, though Marcus was certain it had been deep night when he'd left the house. Time clearly operated according to different rules here, responding to emotional needs rather than astronomical calculations. "Coffee?" she asked, holding up a mug that released steam carrying the aroma of the perfect morning beverage. "You look like you could use some warmth after your walk." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that it was exactly the right temperature and flavor to comfort him after his disturbing exploration. "What did I see out there? Was that real or another illusion?" It was as real as your perception of it, Mrs. Whitmore replied, beginning to prepare eggs and bacon with ingredients that appeared fresh from some impossible farm. You saw the world through the eyes of someone who has spent decades watching institutions fail, watching criminals escape justice, watching victims denied closure. You saw reality filtered through the accumulated disappointment of a career spent serving systems that care more about statistics than souls. She moved to the stove, and Marcus noticed that the cooking process seemed to accelerate beyond normal physical laws. The eggs cooked to perfect consistency in seconds, the bacon reached ideal crispiness without sizzling, and toast emerged from an antique toaster with golden uniformity that suggested supernatural intervention. But that desolation, that abandonment, Marcus protested. Surely that's not an accurate representation of the real world. There are good people out there. Families who love each other, communities that work together to solve problems. Of course there are, Mrs. Whitmore agreed, plating his breakfast with artistic precision. But you've trained yourself not to see them, Detective. Your job required you to focus on humanity's failures, on the crimes and tragedies that prove how often our better angels lose battles against our worst impulses. After decades of professional pessimism, is it any wonder that hope has become almost impossible for you to recognize? Marcus tasted the eggs and found them seasoned with herbs that carried flavors of every perfect breakfast he'd ever eaten. The meal was simultaneously familiar and extraordinary. Comfort food elevated to an art form that nourished both body and spirit. The people who stay here, he said between bites, do they ever regret their decision? Do they ever wonder what they might have accomplished in the real world? Mrs. Whitmore sat across from him with her own plate, her movements carrying the relaxed satisfaction of someone who had found perfect peace with her choices. Do you regret the decisions you didn't make, Detective? Do you wonder what your life might have looked like if you'd become a teacher, or an artist, or a park ranger instead of a police officer? Sometimes, Marcus admitted, surprised by his willingness to voice doubts he'd never shared with anyone else. But those regrets don't torture you, do they? They're simply acknowledgments that life contains infinite possibilities, most of which remain unexplored, regardless of the path we choose. Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried the wisdom of someone who had observed many people grapple with similar questions. The people who stay here find peace with their choice because they're finally living authentically, rather than performing roles that others assign to them. Marcus finished his breakfast and found himself feeling more energized than he had in years. The chronic fatigue that had become his normal state seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a vitality that made him feel capable of extraordinary accomplishments. When he looked out the kitchen window, he could see Sarah running through meadows that stretched beyond the horizon, her pace effortless and sustainable. Jennifer was painting at an easel positioned to catch the perfect morning light, her brush moving with confidence and precision. Thomas was carving a sculpture from a piece of wood that seemed to glow with inner fire. They're not just happy, Marcus realized aloud. They're fulfilling their deepest potential. Exactly, Mrs. Whitmore confirmed. And you could join them, Detective. You could investigate mysteries that matter. Pursue truth without bureaucratic interference. Solve cases that conventional law enforcement has abandoned as impossible. You could be the detective you always dreamed of becoming. Marcus stood and walked to the window, studying the impossible landscape that extended in all directions around the house. Mountains rose in the distance despite the fact that this part of Pennsylvania was geographically flat. Rivers curved through valleys that shouldn't exist, their waters sparkling with crystalline purity. The sky held clouds that formed patterns too perfect to be natural, and the light itself seemed infused with qualities that enhanced rather than merely illuminated everything it touched. This isn't just a house, he said, understanding flooding through him like revelation. This is a pocket dimension, a space that exists outside normal reality. Call it whatever helps you understand, Mrs. Whitmore replied. The important thing is that it's a place where limitations are optional, where people can become who they were always meant to be, rather than who circumstances forced them to become. Marcus thought about his apartment, with its stack of unsolved case files, and its refrigerator containing nothing but leftover takeout and expired condiments. He thought about his colleagues, who had gradually become cynical and burned out just as he had. He thought about the bureaucrats who measured his worth by statistics that had nothing to do with actual justice or truth. Then he thought about the case files he'd read in his room upstairs, investigations that revealed truths about historical mysteries that had puzzled humanity for generations. He thought about working without budget constraints or political interference, pursuing leads wherever they might take him, regardless of jurisdictional boundaries or administrative convenience. "If I stay," he said slowly, "what guarantee do I have that this isn't just an elaborate trap? What assurance do I have that I won't lose myself entirely, that I won't become someone I don't recognize?" Mrs. Whitmore's smile carried infinite patience and understanding. "The same guarantee you have in your current life, Detective. None at all. Every choice involves risk. Every path contains the possibility of transformation that might be uncomfortable or unexpected. The difference is that here, you would be risking becoming more than you are, rather than less." She stood and moved to a cabinet, removing a hand mirror with an ornate silver frame. When she handed it to Marcus, he expected to see his familiar reflection, but the face looking back at him was subtly different. The lines of chronic stress had softened. The eyes held sparks of curiosity and enthusiasm that had been missing for years, and the expression suggested someone who had found purpose and meaning in his daily existence. "This is who you could become," Mrs. Whitmore said gently. "Not someone else, but the authentic version of Marcus Chen that's been buried under decades of compromise and disappointment. The detective who cares more about truth than career advancement, more about justice than bureaucratic approval." Marcus stared at the reflection, recognizing himself while simultaneously seeing possibilities he'd forgotten existed. This version of him looked like someone who woke up excited about the work ahead, someone who found genuine satisfaction in pursuing investigations that mattered. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was profound, suggesting a life lived in alignment with his deepest values rather than in service to institutional expectations. "The choice is yours, Detective," Mrs. Whitmore continued, "but understand that this opportunity won't come again. If you leave now, you'll return to your old life with the memory of what you've seen here, but you'll never be able to find this place again. This moment, this decision, is your one chance to step into the life you were always meant to live." Marcus continued staring at his reflection, seeing not just who he could become, but recognizing who he had always been underneath the layers of professional cynicism and personal isolation. The choice before him wasn't between his current life and something completely foreign. It was between continuing to deny his authentic self and finally allowing that self to flourish. Marcus spent the rest of the morning walking through the house and its impossible grounds, trying to process the magnitude of the decision facing him. He visited each of the missing persons in their respective sanctuaries, observing their contentment and productivity with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades learning to recognize deception and coercion. What he found instead was genuine fulfillment that radiated from each person like warmth from a fire. Sarah took him running through meadows that stretched beyond normal geography, their pace effortless, despite covering distances that should have left them exhausted. As they ran, she described the novel she was writing, a mystery that incorporated elements of her own experience finding sanctuary in Mrs. Whitmore's house. Her prose flowed with the same natural rhythm as her stride, each sentence crafted with precision and purpose. "In my old life," she explained as they paused beside a stream that bubbled with water clearer than any Marcus had ever seen, "I was always running away from something: stress, expectations, disappointment. Here, I run toward discovery, toward possibility, toward the version of myself I always sensed was waiting to emerge." Thomas showed him the workshop, where he created sculptures that seemed to contain living spirits within their wooden forms. Each piece told a story of transformation, depicting figures in various stages of becoming something greater than their original forms. The tools in his workshop were both ancient and impossibly advanced, allowing him to shape wood with precision that transcended normal craftsmanship. "I spent 40 years working in an office job that drained my creativity," Thomas said, running his hands over a carving that seemed to pulse with inner life. "I told myself I'd pursue woodworking when I retired, but retirement just meant trading one form of emptiness for another. Here, every day brings new possibilities for creation, new ways to express what I see in my mind." Jennifer's studio contained paintings that captured light and emotion in ways that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Her canvases displayed landscapes that existed nowhere in the normal world, portraits of people who radiated inner peace, and abstract compositions that somehow told complete stories without recognizable subjects. When Marcus studied her work, he felt transported to places of beauty and tranquility that made the concerns of his former life seem distant and unimportant. "Art was my escape from reality," Jennifer explained, mixing colors that seemed to glow with their own illumination. But here, art is reality. I can paint what I actually see and feel, rather than what others expect me to create. Every brushstroke brings me closer to expressing my authentic vision. Robert's model railway system had expanded far beyond the confines of any normal room, with tracks that curved through landscapes that shifted and evolved as Marcus watched. Miniature trains carried tiny passengers through tunnels that led to other dimensions, over bridges that spanned impossible chasms, and through stations where microscopic figures waited with expressions of anticipation and joy. "I always knew my trains could be more than just a hobby," Robert said, adjusting a signal that somehow controlled the flow of time in one section of the layout. "Here, I can build transportation systems that connect different realities, that carry passengers to destinations they never dreamed of reaching. It's engineering and artistry and magic, all combined into something that serves a purpose greater than entertainment." David's chess sets had multiplied throughout his room, each board displaying different games in progress with opponents who seemed to exist in other dimensions. As Marcus watched, pieces moved of their own accord, implementing strategies that demonstrated intelligence and creativity beyond normal human capability. David sat at the center of this activity, his mind somehow connected to multiple games simultaneously. "Chess was always about more than winning for me," David explained, contemplating a move that would affect 3 different games at once. "It was about understanding patterns, about seeing possibilities that others missed. Here I can play against masters from across time and space, learning strategies that expand my understanding of what's possible when intelligence is freed from conventional limitations." Each person Marcus encountered reinforced the same message. They had found versions of themselves that transcended the limitations imposed by ordinary reality. They weren't victims of an elaborate scheme. They were pioneers who had discovered a form of existence that allowed authentic self-expression without compromise. As afternoon faded into evening, Marcus found himself back in the library, reading case files that demonstrated investigative techniques he'd never learned in police academy. The historical mysteries he'd examined that morning had been joined by contemporary cases, unsolved crimes that had frustrated law enforcement agencies worldwide. Each file contained evidence and insights that went far beyond what conventional investigation could uncover. The Black Dahlia murder revealed connections to a network of Hollywood executives who had covered up evidence to protect their industry's reputation. The Zodiac Killer files included psychological profiles that identified him as someone with access to police communications and forensic evidence. The disappearance of Amelia Earhart showed that she had discovered something during her final flight that powerful interests wanted to remain hidden. Every case demonstrated the same principle. Truth was often obscured not by lack of evidence, but by institutional resistance to revelations that would challenge existing power structures. Conventional law enforcement was constrained by political pressures and bureaucratic requirements that prevented thorough investigation of cases that might prove embarrassing to influential people. But here, in Mrs. Whitmore's sanctuary, those constraints didn't exist. Marcus could pursue truth wherever it led, regardless of who might be implicated or what established narratives might be challenged. He could be the detective he'd always wanted to be, the one who cared more about justice than career advancement. Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the library doorway, as if summoned by his thoughts, carrying a tea service that materialized with the same effortless magic that seemed to govern all aspects of life in the house. She settled into the chair across from his, with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had conducted this conversation many times before. "You're beginning to understand, aren't you?" she asked, pouring tea that released steam-carrying aromas of every perfect cup he'd ever tasted. "You're seeing what becomes possible when artificial limitations are removed." Marcus closed the case file he'd been reading and accepted the offered cup. "The work I could do here, the investigations I could complete, they would make a real difference. I could solve cases that have haunted families for generations, expose corruption that conventional law enforcement can't touch." "Yes," Mrs. Whitmore agreed, "but more importantly, you could do work that fulfills your deepest sense of purpose. You could wake up each day excited about the mysteries you'll explore, the truths you'll uncover, the justice you'll deliver. You could be the detective you always dreamed of becoming." Marcus thought about his apartment, where case files stacked on every surface reminded him daily of his failures and limitations. He thought about his colleagues, who had gradually stopped discussing their idealistic motivations, and focused instead on pension plans and early retirement. He thought about the bureaucrats who measured his worth by statistics that had nothing to do with actual justice. What happens to the part of me that feels responsible for the world I'd be leaving behind? He asked. What about the cases that won't get solved? The victims who won't receive justice because I chose personal fulfillment over professional duty? Mrs. Whitmore's expression grew serious, reflecting genuine understanding of his moral conflict. Tell me, Detective, how many cases have you solved in the past year that truly delivered justice? How many victims, families have found genuine peace through your investigations? How many criminals have you stopped from reoffending through your work within the system? The questions forced Marcus to confront uncomfortable truths about the effectiveness of his career. Most of his cases resulted in plea bargains that satisfied legal requirements without delivering genuine justice. Most of the criminals he arrested would eventually return to lives of crime. Most of the families he'd helped remained trapped in cycles of grief and anger, despite receiving legal closure. But if people like me abandon the system, he protested, echoing his earlier argument, who will try to make it better? People like you don't change systems, Detective. Systems change people like you. Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried the weight of someone who had observed this process repeatedly. They take your passion for justice and redirect it toward bureaucratic compliance. They take your commitment to truth and transform it into willingness to accept convenient explanations. They take everything that makes you special and gradually wear it away until you become just another cog in a machine designed to process cases rather than deliver justice. Marcus felt the truth of her words in his bones, recognizing the gradual erosion of idealism that had characterized his career. How many times had he accepted incomplete solutions because budget constraints demanded quick closure? How many times had he been ordered to stop investigating leads that might prove politically inconvenient? How many times had he gone home feeling like he'd betrayed his own values in service to institutional requirements? Here, Mrs. Whitmore continued, you could investigate without constraints, pursue truth without interference, deliver justice without compromise. You could show what becomes possible when detective work is freed from institutional limitations. Perhaps that example would inspire others to demand better from the systems they serve. The possibility intrigued Marcus more than any argument about personal fulfillment. If he could demonstrate what genuine investigation looked like when freed from bureaucratic constraints, perhaps his work could inspire systemic change rather than perpetuating systemic failure. Perhaps leaving the broken system would be more effective than continuing to enable its dysfunction through his participation. The choice is yours, Mrs. Whitmore said, standing to leave him alone with his thoughts. But remember, Detective, this opportunity comes only once. If you return to your old life, you'll carry the memory of what you've seen here, but you'll never be able to find this place again. Whatever you decide, decide with the knowledge that this moment represents your one chance to step into the life you are always meant to live. As she left the library, Marcus found himself staring at the case files that surrounded him, each one representing the kind of thorough, uncompromising investigation he'd always wanted to conduct. The work here wouldn't just solve individual cases. It would demonstrate what became possible when truth was pursued without political interference or bureaucratic compromise. Outside the library window, night was falling over landscapes that existed beyond normal geography. Stars appeared in patterns that seemed designed to inspire contemplation rather than simply illuminate darkness. The moon rose with light that carried qualities of comfort and revelation, making the garden glow with ethereal beauty. Marcus realized that his decision had already been made, perhaps from the moment he'd first stepped into the house and felt the sense of homecoming that had been missing from his life for decades. The question wasn't whether he would stay. The question was whether he had the courage to acknowledge that staying was what he truly wanted. Marcus woke in his perfectly appointed room to sunlight that carried qualities of renewal and possibility, though he couldn't remember falling asleep. His internal clock suggested he'd rested for exactly the amount of time his body needed to feel completely refreshed, regardless of how many hours had actually passed. The chronic fatigue that had been his constant companion for years had vanished entirely, replaced by an energy and alertness that made him feel decades younger. On his desk lay a new case file that hadn't been there the night before, its contents promising the kind of investigation that would have taken months to complete in his former life, but could be pursued here without artificial constraints or bureaucratic interference. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony, the file was labeled, containing evidence and witness accounts that went far beyond anything conventional historians had ever uncovered. Marcus dressed in clothes that had appeared in his closet overnight, garments that fit him perfectly and seemed designed for both comfort and professional appearance. When he looked in the mirror, he saw the transformation Mrs. Whitmore had shown him the day before. The same face, but with eyes that sparkled with curiosity and purpose rather than cynicism and exhaustion. Downstairs, he found the other residents gathered around the breakfast table, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of people who had slept deeply and awakened to days filled with meaningful work. Sarah was discussing the chapter she'd written the previous evening, a passage that had solved a plot problem she'd been contemplating for weeks. Thomas described a breakthrough in his carving technique that would allow him to create sculptures with even greater emotional resonance. Jennifer had discovered a new color combination that perfectly captured the mood she'd been trying to express in her latest painting. "Marcus," David called out as he entered the dining room. "I've been looking forward to our chess match today. I've prepared a game that will challenge both your detective's logic and your intuitive understanding of human psychology." The casual invitation filled Marcus with anticipation rather than anxiety, suggesting a fundamental shift in his relationship with challenge and competition. In his former life, games and puzzles had been occasional distractions from work-related stress. Here they promised to become tools for expanding his mental capabilities and exploring new forms of strategic thinking. Mrs. Whitmore appeared with breakfast that seemed tailored to his exact nutritional needs and taste preferences, each dish prepared with the kind of attention to detail that transformed eating from necessity to art. The coffee was perfectly brewed, the eggs were seasoned with herbs that enhanced rather than masked their natural flavors, and the fruit carried sweetness that suggested it had been harvested at the peak of ripeness specifically for this meal. "Good morning, Detective," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone greeting a beloved family member. "I trust you slept well? Today promises to bring several interesting developments in your investigation of the Roanoke mystery." Marcus felt a thrill of excitement at the prospect of diving into a case that had puzzled historians for centuries. The file on his desk contained evidence that conventional researchers had never seen, witness accounts that revealed the true fate of the colonists and the reasons behind their mysterious departure. More importantly, he would be able to pursue every lead without worrying about budget constraints or jurisdictional limitations. "I've decided to stay," he announced to the table, surprised by how natural the words felt as he spoke them. "I want to be part of this community, to do the kind of investigative work that's possible here." The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Sarah clapped her hands with genuine delight. Thomas raised his coffee cup in a toast. Jennifer beamed with the satisfaction of an artist who had just seen someone else discover their true calling. Robert nodded with the approval of someone who recognized a fellow seeker of authentic purpose, and David smiled with the strategic satisfaction of a chess player who had anticipated this move several steps in advance. Mrs. Whitmore's expression carried the deep satisfaction of someone who had helped another person find their authentic path. "Welcome home, Marcus," she said simply, and the words resonated with truth that made his chest tighten with emotion. After breakfast, Marcus spent his first official day as a resident, exploring the resources available for his investigations. The library had expanded overnight to include sections on forensic techniques that didn't exist in conventional law enforcement, historical records that had been hidden from public access for centuries, and psychological profiles of criminal types that went far beyond anything taught in police academies. His office had also evolved, now containing equipment that would allow him to analyze evidence with precision that surpassed any government laboratory. Computer systems provided access to databases that contained information about crimes and criminals across time and space. Communication devices allowed him to interview witnesses from different eras, gathering first-hand accounts of events that had been distorted by conventional historical reporting. The Roanoke investigation consumed his attention completely, each discovered clue leading to new avenues of inquiry that revealed a story far more complex and fascinating than the simple mystery of vanished colonists. The settlers hadn't disappeared. They had been relocated to a sanctuary similar to Mrs. Whitmore's house, a place where they could establish a community based on cooperation and mutual support rather than the competitive hierarchies that had dominated European society. As Marcus followed the evidence deeper into the mystery, he realized he was documenting not just a historical event, but a pattern that had repeated throughout human history. In every era, there had been people who sought alternatives to conventional society, who were willing to risk everything for the possibility of living authentically, rather than conforming to systems that demanded the sacrifice of individual potential for collective mediocrity. The investigation took on personal meaning, as Marcus recognized himself in the historical accounts of the Roanoke colonists. Like him, they had been offered a choice between continuing to struggle within systems that consistently failed to deliver on their promises and stepping into an unknown reality that offered the possibility of becoming their best selves. Evening arrived with the same gradual beauty that marked all transitions in this place, and Marcus found himself joining his new family for dinner conversations that ranged across topics of art and science and philosophy with the kind of intellectual stimulation he'd been craving for decades. Everyone contributed insights from their own areas of expertise, creating discussions that enhanced rather than drained his mental energy. After dinner, he played chess with David, discovering that the game served as a form of meditation that sharpened his analytical thinking while simultaneously developing his intuitive understanding of human psychology. Each move revealed new layers of strategy that applied to investigative work as well as gaming, teaching him to see patterns and possibilities that had been invisible in his former approach to detective work. When the evening concluded, Marcus returned to his room with a sense of completion he hadn't experienced in years. His first day as a resident of Mrs. Whitmore's sanctuary had exceeded every expectation, providing intellectual stimulation, meaningful work, and genuine community in ways that his former life had never achieved. As he prepared for sleep, he looked out his window at the garden where his new friends were sharing stories around the fire pit, their faces glowing with contentment and mutual affection. The last thought that crossed his mind before sleep claimed him was a profound sense of gratitude for having found the courage to choose authenticity over conformity, purpose over security, and growth over stagnation. For the first time in decades, Marcus Chen was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do, surrounded by people who understood and appreciated his true nature. In the morning, he would continue his investigation into the Roanoke mystery, pursue leads that conventional historians could never access, and deliver truths that would expand humanity's understanding of its own hidden history. He would be the detective he had always dreamed of becoming, freed from the limitations that had constrained his potential for so long. Outside his window, the grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of his old life and the beginning of something infinitely better. The house settled around him with the satisfied sigh of a sanctuary that had successfully welcomed another lost soul home to authentic purpose and genuine happiness. 3 months later, Detective Marcus Chen was officially declared missing after his abandoned vehicle was found near the Whitmore house, which local authorities described as structurally unsound and scheduled for demolition. His former colleagues conducted a thorough investigation, but found no evidence of foul play, concluding that he had likely suffered some form of psychological breakdown and wandered away from his vehicle in a state of confusion. The missing persons case was eventually closed due to lack of evidence, filed away with dozens of other unsolved disappearances that had occurred in the vicinity of the abandoned house over the decades. Local residents continued to report seeing lights in the supposedly empty structure and hearing sounds of laughter and conversation drifting from its interior, but these accounts were dismissed as imagination influenced by the building's notorious reputation. The house itself was never demolished despite repeated municipal orders, as work crews consistently reported equipment failures and unexplained accidents that prevented completion of the project. Eventually, the city decided that the cost of demolition exceeded the property's value, and the structure was left to continue its patient vigil at the end of Elm Street. On quiet evenings, neighbors sometimes noticed warm light glowing from the windows of the supposedly abandoned house, and a few claimed to have seen figures moving through the rooms with the peaceful efficiency of people engaged in meaningful work. Children dared each other to approach the front gate, but those brave enough to get close reported feeling an overwhelming sense of welcome that made them want to stay rather than run away. The truth, of course, was that Detective Marcus Chen had found exactly what he'd been searching for his entire adult life, a place where he could pursue justice without compromise, investigate mysteries without constraints, and live authentically rather than performing roles assigned by others. Along with Sarah, Thomas, Jennifer, Robert, and David, he had become part of a community dedicated to helping lost souls discover their authentic potential. Mrs. Whitmore continued her patient work, watching for individuals whose spirits had been crushed by systems that demanded conformity over creativity, compliance over authenticity, mediocrity over excellence. The house stood ready to offer sanctuary to anyone brave enough to choose growth over safety, purpose over security, and truth over comfortable lies. And somewhere in the impossible spaces within those Victorian walls, Detective Marcus Chen continued his investigations into mysteries that conventional law enforcement would never be allowed to solve, pursuing truth with the dedication and freedom he had always dreamed of achieving. He had found his way home at last, to a place where being his authentic self was not only accepted, but celebrated as the greatest gift he could offer to the world. What moment in this story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoy this narrative, please subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world to me, and helps keep these stories coming.